Welcome to True.
The Reckoning: What Really Happened to Hitler's Friends and Colleagues After World War II. A full documentary. Fade in. Narrator: Vo. May 8, 1945. The Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, lies in ruins after just 12. Berlin is a wasteland of rubble and ash. The Nazi regime that terrorized Europe and murdered millions has finally collapsed. But what became of those who stood beside Adolf Hitler, the architects of genocide, the true believers, the opportunists, who rode the wave of fascism to power? Their fates would prove as varied as their crimes were universal. This is the story of The Reckoning. Act 1. The Last Days. Narrator: Vo. In the final days of April 1945, Hitler's inner circle found themselves trapped in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The walls were closing in, literally and figuratively. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder each day. These men and women, who had wielded absolute power over much of Europe, now faced a stark choice: capture, suicide, or escape. Let us begin with those who were closest to Hitler himself. Joseph Goebbels, the propagandist's final act. Photographs. Goebbels throughout the years. Narrator: Vo. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, had been with Hitler since the early days of the Nazi Party, a master manipulator who turned lies into art and hatred into policy. In the bunker's final hours, Goebbels made a decision that would shock even hardened observers. Historian #1. Interview. Goebbels was a true believer until the very end. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, Goebbels became Chancellor for exactly 1 day, but he had no intention of outliving his Führer. Narrator: Vo. On May 1st, 1945, Josef and Magda Goebbels murdered their 6 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, by having an SS doctor inject them with morphine and then crushing cyanide capsules in their mouths. The children's names were Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Haida, all given names beginning with H in honor of Hitler. Historian #2. Interview. It's one of the most chilling aspects of the Nazi collapse. These were educated, cultured people by any external measure, yet their ideology had so consumed them that they couldn't imagine their children living in a world without National Socialism. Magda Goebbels reportedly said, "Our children are too good for the world that's coming." Narrator: Vo. After murdering their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up to the Chancellery garden. They took cyanide capsules, and may have also been shot by an SS orderly. Their bodies were burned, but only partially, and were later identified by Soviet forces. Unlike Hitler's remains, which remain mysterious to this day, there was no doubt about the Goebbels' fate. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of genocide. Photographs. Himmler in SS uniform. Narrator: Vo. If Goebbels was the voice of Nazi evil, Heinrich Himmler was its cold, bureaucratic hand. As Reichsführer of the SS and the chief architect of the Holocaust, Himmler bore responsibility for the deaths of millions. But unlike Goebbels, Himmler had no intention of dying for his Führer. Historian #3. Interview. Himmler tried to save himself. In the final weeks of the war, he even attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte of Sweden. When Hitler learned of this betrayal, he expelled Himmler from the party and stripped him of all ranks in one of his final acts. Narrator: Vo. After Germany's surrender, Himmler disguised himself as a sergeant in the secret military police, shaving his mustache and wearing an eye patch. For 2 weeks, he evaded capture, traveling with fake papers under the name Heinrich Hitzinger. But on May 23, 1945, British soldiers arrested him at a checkpoint near Bremen. During a medical examination, before he could be properly interrogated, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. He died within minutes, denying the world the opportunity to put him on trial for his unprecedented crimes. Historian #1. Interview. The irony is profound. Himmler, who sent millions to their deaths, chose to take his own life rather than face justice. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on Lüneburg Heath, the location kept secret to prevent it from becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal's trial. Archival footage. Göring at Nuremberg. Narrator: Vo. Hermann Göring. Hitler's designated successor, commander of the Luftwaffe, and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, did not choose the coward's way of suicide in the bunker. Instead, Goering fled south to Bavaria, where he sent a telegram to Hitler suggesting that he take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler, furious at what he saw as betrayal, ordered Goering's arrest and stripped him of all offices. Historian #2 interview. Goering surrendered to American forces on May 8, 1945. Unlike Himmler, he seemed to believe that his status as a former World War I flying ace and his early position in the Nazi hierarchy might earn him lenient treatment. He was spectacularly wrong. Narrator, VO. Goering became the highest-ranking Nazi official to face justice at the Nuremberg trials. During the proceedings, he defended the Nazi regime vigorously, showing no remorse. He was articulate, defiant, and attempted to portray himself as a loyal soldier rather than a war criminal. Prosecutor. Archival audio. Your signature appears on documents ordering the persecution of Jews, the plunder of occupied territories, and the murder of prisoners of war. Goring. Archival audio. I followed orders and did my duty as a German officer. Narrator, though, on October 1st, 1946, Goering was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging, but Hermann Goering would have one final act of defiance. Historian #3 interview. Hours before his scheduled execution on October 16, 1946, Goering committed suicide by taking a cyanide capsule. To this day, no one knows for certain how he obtained it. Some believe it was hidden in his cell all along, others that a sympathetic guard smuggled it to him. What we do know is that he chose his own death over the gallows. Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer's Strange Odyssey. Photographs. Rudolf Hess. Narrator, VO. Rudolf Hess presents one of the most bizarre stories in the Nazi collapse. Hitler's deputy Führer and one of his oldest associates, Hess made a solo flight to Scotland in May 1941, apparently attempting to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. Hitler disavowed him, and Hess spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner. Historian #1 interview. At Nuremberg, Hess was clearly mentally unstable. He claimed amnesia at various points, made bizarre statements, and seemed detached from reality. Nevertheless, he was found guilty of crimes against peace and conspiracy, though acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Narrator, VO. Sentenced to life imprisonment, Hess was transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he remained for over 40 years. As other prisoners died or were released, Hess became Spandau's sole inmate, guarded by a rotating international detail of American, British, French, and Soviet troops. Historian #2 interview. By the 1980s, keeping Spandau open for one elderly prisoner was increasingly absurd and expensive. The Soviets blocked all attempts to release him, possibly because they wanted to maintain their symbolic presence in West Berlin. Narrator, though. On August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, Rudolf Hess was found dead in a summer house in the prison garden, apparently having hanged himself with an electrical cord. Some conspiracy theories suggest he was murdered, but multiple investigations concluded it was suicide. Spandau prison was demolished shortly afterward to prevent it from becoming a Nazi shrine. Act 2, The Nuremberg Trials. Archival footage, Nuremberg courtroom. Narrator, though. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, represented an unprecedented attempt to hold leaders accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 24 high-ranking Nazis were indicted, though only 21 faced trial. Let us examine what became of those who stood in the dock. The foreign policy makers. Narrator, VO. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, had been instrumental in the diplomatic preparation for war. He negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union and was deeply involved in the persecution of Jews in occupied territories. Historian #3 interview. Ribbentrop was widely despised, even by his fellow Nazis. Arrogant and incompetent, he maintained until the end that he was merely a diplomat following orders. The tribunal wasn't convinced. Narrator, though. Found guilty on all counts, Ribbentrop was the first Nazi leader to be executed at Nuremberg. On October 16, 1946, he walked to the gallows still professing his loyalty to Hitler. His last words were, "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany rediscover her unity." Historian #1 interview. Konstantin von Neurath, who preceded Ribbentrop as foreign minister and later served as Reichsprotektor of Bohemia and Moravia, received a more lenient sentence. He was sentenced to 15 years, but was released in 1954 due to poor health. He died in 1956. The military leaders. Photographs: Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. Narrator: VO. The military leadership's fate revealed the complexities of determining guilt. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, had signed numerous orders that led to war crimes, including the notorious Commando Order that mandated the execution of captured Allied commandos. Historian #2 interview. Keitel tried to argue that he was a soldier following orders from Hitler, but the tribunal found that he had been complicit in planning aggressive war and implementing criminal policies. He was hanged on October 16, 1946. Narrator: VO. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations staff, met the same fate. He was hanged alongside Keitel, though he maintained that he had only done his duty as a soldier. Interestingly, a German denazification court posthumously exonerated Jodl in 1953, though this ruling was later overturned. Historian #3 interview. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz presented a different case. As commander of the German Navy and Hitler's designated successor, who briefly served as president after Hitler's death, Dönitz was convicted primarily of crimes against peace. He received 10 years in Spandau and was released in 1956. He lived until 1980, never expressing remorse for his role in the Nazi regime. The Civilian Administrators of Horror. Photographs: Hans Frank, Arthur Seyss, Inquart. Narrator: VO. Some of the most disturbing stories belong to those who administered occupied territories with brutal efficiency. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, had earned the nickname Butcher of Poland. Under his rule, millions of Poles and Jews were murdered or sent to death camps. At Nuremberg, Frank underwent what appeared to be a religious conversion, returning to Catholicism and expressing remorse for his crimes. Historian #1 interview. Frank's apparent contrition was unique among the defendants. He testified that 1,000 years will pass and still Germany's guilt will not be erased. However, some historians debate whether this was genuine remorse or a calculated attempt to earn mercy. Narrator: VO. It didn't work. Hans Frank was hanged on October 16, 1946. Arthur Seyss Inquart, who had served as Chancellor of Austria during the Anschluss and later as Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands, was convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in deporting Dutch Jews and implementing forced labor programs. He too was executed on October 16th. Albert Speer, the remorseful architect. Photographs: Albert Speer. Narrator: VO. Perhaps no figure from the Nuremberg trials has generated more controversy than Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, and later Minister of Armaments and War Production. Historian #2 interview. Speer was intelligent, charismatic, and appeared genuinely remorseful. He accepted responsibility for the Nazi regime's crimes, even though he claimed ignorance of the full extent of the Holocaust. This set him apart from the other defendants. Narrator: VO. At Nuremberg, Speer testified that he had been seduced by Hitler and had failed in his moral responsibility to investigate what was really happening. He acknowledged using slave labor in armaments production, but claimed he had tried to improve conditions. Historian #3 interview. The question of Speer's genuine knowledge remains controversial. Evidence suggests he knew far more about the Holocaust than he admitted. He attended conferences where the extermination of Jews was discussed, but his expressions of remorse and his willingness to accept responsibility impressed the tribunal. So, narrator: VO. Speer was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. He was released in 1966 and went on to write 2 best-selling books, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries. He maintained his stance as the good Nazi who had been deceived by Hitler until his death in 1981. Modern historians remain divided on whether Speer deserves this relatively sympathetic image. The propagandists and ideologues. Narrator: VO. Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic publisher of Der Stürmer newspaper, was perhaps the most personally repugnant of the defendants. His pornographic anti-Jewish propaganda had helped prepare the German population for genocide. Historian #1 interview. Stryker had actually fallen out of favor with the Nazi leadership before the war's end and held no significant government position. Some questioned whether he should even be tried at Nuremberg, but the prosecution successfully argued that his propaganda was a crucial element in creating the conditions for the Holocaust. Narrator, VO. Convicted of crimes against humanity, Stryker shouted, "Heil Hitler!" as he walked to the gallows on October 16, 1946. His last words were, Purim Festival 1946, referring to the Jewish holiday celebrating the defeat of Haman, who had plotted to kill the Jews of Persia. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief racial theorist and Reich minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, was also hanged. His pseudo-intellectual writings had provided ideological justification for Nazi racial policies and the subjugation of Slavic peoples. The acquittals, photographs, Franz von Papen, Hjalmar Schacht, narrator, though, not everyone at Nuremberg was convicted. 3 defendants were acquitted, to considerable controversy. Franz von Papen, the conservative politician who had helped Hitler become chancellor in 1933, was found not guilty. Hjalmar Schacht, the economics minister who helped finance German rearmament, was also acquitted, and Hans Fritzsche, a radio propagandist, was found not guilty, though many felt he was a substitute for Goebbels, who had killed himself. Historian #2. Interview. The acquittals were actually important. They demonstrated that the tribunal was conducting genuine legal proceedings, not simply show trials. However, both Papen and Schacht were immediately rearrested by German authorities and tried in denazification courts, where they received prison sentences. Act 3. Those Who Escaped. Map showing escape routes through Europe and to South America. Narrator, though. While the top Nazi leaders faced judgment at Nuremberg, thousands of others fled. Some committed suicide, but many escaped, often with help from sympathetic networks. The most notorious escape route became known as the Rat Line. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of death. Photographs, Eichmann. Narrator, though. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust, was one of the most wanted Nazi fugitives. He had arranged the deportation of millions of Jews to death camps with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. Historian #3. Interview. After the war, Eichmann was captured by American forces, but escaped from an internment camp in 1946. He lived under assumed names in Germany for several years before fleeing to Argentina in 1950, traveling on a Vatican-issued refugee passport under the name Ricardo Clement. Narrator, VO. For over a decade, Eichmann lived quietly in Buenos Aires with his wife and children. He worked various jobs, including at a Mercedes-Benz factory. Meanwhile, Nazi hunters, particularly Simon Wiesenthal and a dedicated team from Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, were on his trail. Historian #1. Interview. The operation to capture Eichmann was one of the most audacious in intelligence history. In May 1960, a team of Mossad agents kidnapped Eichmann from a street in Buenos Aires. They held him in a safe house for 9 days, then smuggled him out of Argentina on an El Al flight, sedated and disguised as an airline employee. Narrator, VO. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 became a watershed moment. Unlike Nuremberg, which focused on the Nazi leadership, this trial put the Holocaust itself at center stage. Survivor after survivor testified about the horrors they had endured. Prosecutor, archival audio. Did you organize the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to their deaths? Eichmann, archival audio translated. I was following orders. I was a recipient of orders. Had I been ordered to kill my father, I would have done it. Narrator, though. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes, Adolf Eichmann was hanged on May 31, 1962. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered in the Mediterranean Sea outside Israeli waters. He remains the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. Yosef Mengele, the Angel of Death. Photographs, Mengele. Narrator, though. Perhaps no Nazi fugitive has captured public imagination more than Josef Mengele, the SS physician who conducted sadistic medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, particularly twins. Historian #2. Interview. Mengele's escape was remarkably easy. He was briefly held by American forces, but was released because they didn't realize who he was. Using his own name initially, he worked as a farmhand in Bavaria before fleeing to South America in 1949. Narrator, Vo. Mengele lived in Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil. Unlike Eichmann, he managed to evade capture for the rest of his life, despite massive efforts to find him. He moved frequently, used aliases, and benefited from protection by local sympathizers. Historian #3, interview. By the 1970s, Mengele had become isolated and paranoid. His family in Germany had cut off financial support. He lived in poverty in Brazil, working odd jobs and moving from place to place. Narrator, Vo. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach resort in Bertioga, Brazil. He drowned and was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. His true identity wasn't confirmed until 1985, when forensic experts exhumed the grave. DNA testing in 1992 provided final confirmation. The man who had escaped justice for over 3 decades had been dead for 6 years before anyone knew. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. Photographs, Klaus Barbie. Narrator, Vo. Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France, earned his nickname through his torture and murder of French resistance members and his deportation of Jews, including 44 Jewish children from an orphanage in Isieux. Historian #1, interview. What makes Barbie's case particularly disturbing is that he was recruited by American intelligence after the war. The US used him as an anti-communist operative, protecting him from French authorities who wanted him for war crimes. Narrator, Vo. In 1951, American intelligence helped Barbie and his family escape to Bolivia via the Rat Line. He lived there under the name Klaus Altmann, becoming a successful businessman and advisor to Bolivian military governments. Historian #2, interview. Barbie was linked to the Bolivian regime's human rights abuses and even helped track down Che Guevara. He lived openly, confident in his protection by the Bolivian military. Narrator, Vo. But in 1983, when Bolivia returned to democratic rule, France renewed its extradition request. Barbie was arrested and sent to France, where he finally faced trial in 1987, 42 years after the end of World War II. Historian #3, interview. The trial was emotionally charged. Barbie showed no remorse. He dismissed his crimes as no worse than French actions in Algeria or American actions in Vietnam. He even tried to portray himself as a freedom fighter against communism. Narrator, Vo. Klaus Barbie was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. He died of cancer in Lyon in 1991, maintaining his Nazi convictions to the end. Act 4, The Hidden Servants. Photographs, various Nazi officials. Narrator, Vo. For every high-profile fugitive, there were hundreds of lesser-known Nazis who successfully disappeared into post-war society, often with help from various organizations and governments. The Rat Lines, Organized Escape. Historian #1, interview. The so-called Rat Lines were networks that helped Nazis escape to South America, the Middle East, and other destinations. Some routes were run by former SS officers, others by sympathetic clergy, particularly in the Catholic Church. Narrator, Vo. Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, was instrumental in helping Nazis obtain false papers and Vatican refugee documents. While the Vatican's official role remains controversial, individual clergy members definitely assisted Nazi fugitives. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka death camp, where approximately 900,000 people were murdered, escaped to Brazil via the Rat Line with Vatican assistance. He lived openly in Sao Paulo, working at a Volkswagen factory under his own name. Historian #2, interview. In 1967, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal located Stangl. He was arrested and extradited to West Germany, where he was tried and convicted of mass murder. He received a life sentence and died in prison in 1971. Nazi scientists and Operation Paperclip. Photographs, Werner von Braun and other scientists. Narrator, Vo. One of the most morally complex aspects of the post-war period was the recruitment of Nazi scientists by both the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans called their program Operation Paperclip. Historian #3, interview. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States. The most famous was Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist who had developed the V2 rocket. These weapons had killed thousands of civilians in Britain, and their production involved slave labor that killed thousands more. Narrator, Vo. Von Braun's past was sanitized. He became the face of America's space program, eventually helping to put a man on the moon. When asked about his Nazi past, von Braun claimed he had been apolitical, interested only in rocketry. Evidence suggests otherwise. He had been an SS officer and was aware of the slave labor conditions. Historian #1, interview. The justification was Cold War pragmatism. America wanted these scientists rather than letting them fall into Soviet hands. The Soviets had their own operation, recruiting German scientists for their rocket and weapons programs. Narrator, Vo. Arthur Rudolph, another rocket scientist brought to America, had been operations director of the Mittelwerk factory, where V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp prisoners under horrific conditions. He worked for NASA for decades before investigations in the 1980s led to his departure from the United States. He was never prosecuted. Historian #2, interview. The question remains, did the ends justify the means? Did advancing American scientific and military capabilities justify harboring individuals complicit in Nazi atrocities? It's a moral compromise that still troubles historians today. Act 5, The Long Pursuit of Justice. Contemporary footage, Holocaust memorials. Narrator, Vo. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals didn't end with the Nuremberg trials or even the dramatic captures of Eichmann and Barbie. It continued for decades, driven by dedicated individuals who refused to let the guilty live out their days in peace. The Nazi Hunters. Historian #3, interview. Simon Wiesenthal became the most famous Nazi hunter, but there were many others. Fritz Bauer, the German prosecutor who provided crucial information about Eichmann's whereabouts to Mossad, also initiated the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960s. Narrator, Vo. The Frankfurt trials, held from 1963 to 1965, prosecuted 22 defendants who had worked at Auschwitz. These trials were significant because they took place in West Germany itself, forcing Germans to confront their recent past. Historian #1, interview. Beate and Serge Klarsfeld, a German-French couple, devoted their lives to tracking down Nazi criminals. They were instrumental in locating Klaus Barbie and exposing Kurt Lischka, who had organized deportations of Jews from France. Narrator, Vo. The Klarsfelds used unconventional tactics, including publicity stunts to shame governments into action. Beate Klarsfeld famously slapped West German Chancellor Kurt Kiesinger in public to draw attention to his Nazi past. The Office of Special Investigations, seal of the OSI. Narrator, Vo. In 1979, the United States created the Office of Special Investigations within the Justice Department to identify and deport Nazi war criminals who had entered the country illegally by lying about their wartime activities. Historian #2, interview. The OSI brought cases against over 100 individuals. Some were deported, others were denaturalized and left voluntarily. The most notable case was probably that of John Demjanjuk. Narrator, Vo. John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian who had immigrated to the United States, was accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a notoriously cruel guard at Treblinka death camp. He was extradited to Israel in 1986 and convicted in 1988. However, the conviction was overturned in 1993 when evidence suggested mistaken identity. Historian #3, interview. But the story didn't end there. New evidence showed that Demjanjuk had been a guard at Sobibor death camp. He was extradited to Germany in 2009 and convicted in 2011 of being an accessory to the murder of 28,060 Jews. He died in 2012 while his appeal was pending. Late trials, justice decades later, recent courtroom footage. Narrator, Vo. Into the 21st century, Germany continued to prosecute Nazi war criminals, even as they reached their 90s and hundreds. Oskar Groening, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted in 2015 at age 94 for being an accessory to the murder of 300,000 Jews. He died in 2018 before beginning his prison sentence. Reinhold Hanning, a former SS guard at Auschwitz, was convicted at age 94 in 2016. He died later that year. Historian #1, interview. Critics argued that prosecuting elderly men was pointless. They'd lived full lives and would serve little to no prison time before dying. But proponents argued that justice has no expiration date, and these trials served important educational and symbolic purposes. Narrator, Vo. In 2020, Bruno Day, a former SS guard at Stutthof concentration camp, was convicted at age 93. Due to his age at the time of the crimes, he had been 17 and 18, he received a 2-year suspended sentence. These late trials represented a shift in German legal thinking. Rather than requiring proof that defendants personally committed murders, courts held that anyone who had served at a death camp as a guard was guilty of being an accessory to murder. Act 6. The Ones Who Never Faced Justice. Various photographs. Narrator, a VO. Despite decades of effort, many Nazi war criminals lived out their lives without ever being caught or prosecuted. Some died before being identified, others remained protected by sympathetic governments, or simply lost in the chaos of post-war society. Alois Brunner, the Unrepentant, Historian #2, Interview. Alois Brunner, Adolf Eichmann's right-hand man, was responsible for deporting over 128,000 Jews to death camps. After the war, he worked for American intelligence before escaping to Syria in the 1950s. Narrator, VO. Protected by the Syrian government, Brunner lived in Damascus for decades. He gave unrepentant interviews, saying he regretted that he didn't finish the job of killing all Jews. The Mossad tried twice to kill him, sending him letter bombs that cost him an eye and several fingers, but he survived. Historian #3, Interview. Brunner was sentenced to death in absentia by both France and Germany, but Syria never extradited him. He reportedly died in 2010, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. He never faced trial. Aribert Heim, The Question of Death. Narrator, VO. Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death, was an SS doctor at Mauthausen concentration camp who conducted sadistic experiments on prisoners. After the war, he practiced medicine in Germany for years before fleeing to Egypt in 1962 when investigations began. Historian #1, Interview. For decades, Heim was one of the most wanted Nazi fugitives. The Simon Wiesenthal Center offered rewards for information, but in 2009, German authorities announced he had died in Cairo in 1992, converting to Islam and living under an assumed name. Narrator, VO. His family produced documents including a death certificate and the testimony of his son. However, some investigators remained skeptical, noting that death reports had been used to throw pursuers off the trail before. The Nameless Thousands. Historian #2, Interview. For every high-profile Nazi we know about, there were thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators who simply disappeared into normal life. Guards at concentration camps, members of Einsatzgruppen death squads, bureaucrats who processed deportation orders. Many were never identified or prosecuted. Narrator, VO. Some integrated into West German society, becoming teachers, businessmen, civil servants. East Germany, meanwhile, claimed to have thoroughly denazified while actually employing former Nazis when convenient. Austria, which had been annexed by Germany, often portrayed itself as Hitler's first victim, rather than a willing participant. Historian #3, Interview. The uncomfortable truth is that complete justice was impossible. There were simply too many perpetrators, too much evidence destroyed, too many witnesses dead, and too much political will to move on. Act 7. Reflections on Guilt and Memory. Contemporary Germany, Holocaust Memorials. Narrator, VO. The fate of Hitler's colleagues and the long pursuit of Nazi war criminals raises profound questions about justice, guilt, and memory. The question of remorse. Historian #1, Interview. Very few Nazi leaders expressed genuine remorse. Albert Speer claimed to, but historians debate his sincerity. Hans Frank seemed to find religion, but was this genuine or strategic? Most went to their deaths maintaining they had only followed orders or done their duty. Narrator, VO. This absence of remorse is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the post-war reckoning. These were educated, cultured individuals who had orchestrated industrial-scale murder, yet they showed less conscience than common criminals. Historian #2, Interview. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed while covering the Eichmann trial, remains relevant. These weren't monsters in appearance. They were bureaucrats, soldiers, administrators, ordinary people who committed extraordinary evil. The Divided Legacy of Justice. Narrator, VO. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals created precedents that shaped international law. The Nuremberg trials established that following orders was not a valid defense for crimes against humanity. They created a framework for prosecuting genocide and war crimes that continues to this day. Historian #3 Interview. The International Criminal Court, tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, trials for Khmer Rouge leaders, all trace their lineage back to Nuremberg. The principle that individuals can be held accountable for state-sponsored atrocities was revolutionary. Narrator, VO. Yet the pursuit of justice was always incomplete and sometimes compromised. Scientists were recruited for Cold War purposes. Some criminals lived comfortable lives in South America or the Middle East. Others died before facing trial, and thousands were never even identified. Historian #1 Interview. We also can't ignore the double standards. Allied bombing campaigns that killed civilians were never prosecuted. Soviet atrocities went unpunished. The focus was specifically on Nazi crimes, which were unprecedented in their scope. But this selective justice troubled some observers. The importance of memory. Footage. Students visiting Holocaust museums. Narrator, VO. Perhaps the most important legacy of pursuing Hitler's associates wasn't the punishments themselves, but what the trials represented, a refusal to forget. Historian #2 Interview. Every trial, every capture, every conviction served an educational purpose. They kept the memory of the Holocaust alive. They provided testimony and documentation. They forced societies to confront what had happened. Narrator, VO. The testimony at trials became crucial historical evidence. Survivors who testified, like those at the Eichmann trial, helped ensure that denial and revisionism would face an insurmountable wall of documented truth. Historian #3 Interview. Germany's handling of its past evolved over decades. Initially, there was widespread denial and a desire to move on, but persistent documentation, trials, and education gradually created a culture of remembrance. Today, Germany is often held up as a model for how nations can confront historical atrocities. The personal costs. Photographs. Nazi hunters and survivors. Narrator, VO. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals took a personal toll on those who dedicated their lives to it. Simon Wiesenthal faced death threats and harassment. The Klarsfelds risked their safety repeatedly. Survivors who testified relived their traumas. Historian #1 Interview. For many survivors and their descendants, seeing perpetrators brought to justice provided some measure of closure, though nothing could truly compensate for what was lost. The trials acknowledged their suffering and validated their experiences. Narrator, VO. But questions remain about whether justice was truly served. If a guard at Auschwitz lives freely for 70 years before spending his final months in prison, can that be called justice? If a death camp commandant enjoys decades with his family before a trial, what meaning does punishment have? Historian #2 Interview. These are philosophical questions without clear answers. What we can say is that the effort itself mattered. It sent a message that genocide would not be forgotten, that perpetrators would be hunted, that the world would not simply move on. Modern echoes. Contemporary news footage. Narrator, VO. The fate of Hitler's colleagues continues to resonate in the 21st century. When mass atrocities occur in Syria, Myanmar, Sudan, the question arises, will there be accountability? Historian #3 Interview. The precedent set by Nuremberg and subsequent Nazi trials created expectations. The world now recognizes crimes against humanity and has mechanisms, however imperfect, to prosecute them. This is a direct legacy of the post-World War II reckoning. Narrator, VO. Modern technology has also changed the pursuit of justice. DNA evidence confirmed Mengele's death and convicted others. Digital records make it harder to hide. Satellite imagery documents atrocities. The lessons learned from hunting Nazi war criminals inform contemporary investigations. Historian #1 Interview. But new challenges have emerged. How do you prosecute leaders who remain in power? How do you balance peace negotiations with demands for justice? How do you handle the sheer scale when thousands or millions participate in atrocities? These were questions the Nazi trials only partially answered. The collaborators and enablers. Photographs. Various collaborators. Narrator, VO. We must also consider those who weren't in Hitler's inner circle but enabled the Nazi regime, collaborators in occupied countries, business leaders who profited from slave labor, citizens who participated in persecution, or simply looked away. And historian #2 interview. After the war, countries handled collaboration differently. France had a brutal reckoning, with thousands of suspected collaborators executed, often without trial. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway conducted extensive trials, but many collaborators received relatively light sentences, especially as the Cold War intensified. Narrator, VO. Pierre Laval, head of the Vichy French government, was executed in 1945. Vidkun Quisling, Norway's fascist leader, whose name became synonymous with traitor, was also executed, but countless others, who had facilitated deportations or worked with the Nazi occupation, received minimal punishment. Historian #3 interview. The industrial enablers presented complex cases. Companies like IG Farben, which produced Zyklon B gas for the chambers, or Krupp, which used slave labor, their executives faced trials at Nuremberg, but the companies themselves often emerged relatively intact, though sometimes under different names. Narrator, VO. Friedrich Flick, an industrialist who used over 40,000 forced laborers, was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 7 years. After his release, he rebuilt his fortune and became one of the richest men in West Germany. He never paid reparations to his former slave laborers. Alfred Krupp was convicted of crimes against humanity for using slave labor. He was sentenced to 12 years, but was released after 3. His property was returned, and he rebuilt the Krupp industrial empire. Historian #1 interview. These cases illustrate the limitations of the post-war justice system. As the Cold War began, Western powers prioritized rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against communism over thoroughly prosecuting every perpetrator. The women of the Third Reich. Photographs. Female concentration camp guards. Narrator, VO. While most of Hitler's inner circle were men, women also played significant roles in Nazi crimes, particularly as concentration camp guards and administrators. Irma Greze, known as the Hyena of Auschwitz, was a guard at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, notorious for her sadism. She was tried by a British military court and hanged in December 1945 at age 22, one of the youngest war criminals executed. Historian #2 interview. Ilse Koch, wife of the Buchenwald commandant, was accused of particularly depraved behavior, including having items made from the tattooed skin of prisoners. She was tried by American military authorities, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. She committed suicide in prison in 1967. Narrator, VO. Herta Bolte, a guard at several concentration camps, was convicted by a British military court and sentenced to 10 years. She was released in 1951. When interviewed decades later, she showed no remorse, stating, "Do I feel guilty? No. The past is the past." Historian #3 interview. These cases challenged simplistic notions about gender and violence. Women participated in atrocities, sometimes with as much cruelty as their male counterparts. The post-war justice system struggled with how to handle female perpetrators. The doctors and scientists, photographs, Nazi medical experiments documentation. Narrator, VO. Beyond the rocket scientists of Operation Paperclip, numerous doctors who conducted horrific experiments faced varying fates. Historian #1 interview. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg prosecuted 23 physicians and administrators. 7 were executed, including Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, who was hanged in 1948. Others received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Narrator, VO. But many escaped justice. Dozens of doctors who participated in forced sterilization programs, euthanasia of disabled people, and medical experiments disappeared or returned to medical practice. Some even published research based on their unethical experiments. Horst Schumann, who conducted sterilization experiments at Auschwitz, fled to Egypt and then Ghana, where he practiced medicine for years before being extradited to West Germany in 1966. He was deemed unfit to stand trial due to illness and was never convicted. Historian #2 interview. This raises disturbing questions about the medical community's complicity. Many doctors knew about these experiments. Some built careers on that knowledge. The post-war medical establishment was often reluctant to fully investigate or prosecute medical war crimes. The intelligence assets, Documents, declassified intelligence files. Narrator, VO. The Cold War created strange bedfellows. Both Western and Soviet intelligence services recruited former Nazis, valuing their expertise over justice for their crimes. Historian #3 interview. Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front, was recruited by the U.S. Army and later established West Germany's intelligence service, the BND. He brought numerous former SS and Wehrmacht intelligence officers with him. Some had committed war crimes, many had knowledge of them. Narrator, VO. Otto von Bolschwing, an SS officer who worked closely with Eichmann on Jewish deportations, was recruited by the CIA and eventually brought to the United States. When his past was exposed in the 1980s, he faced deportation but died before proceedings concluded. Klaus Barbie, as we discussed, worked for U.S. Army intelligence before escaping to Bolivia. His case became particularly embarrassing when revealed, showing how Cold War priorities had trumped justice. Historian #1 interview. The Soviets did the same thing. They recruited German scientists, intelligence officers, and military experts. Both sides rationalized this as necessary for national security, but it meant that people who should have faced trial instead became valuable assets. The legacy and families, contemporary interviews, descendants of Nazis, narrator, VO. The children and grandchildren of Hitler's associates have grappled with their family legacies in different ways. Historian #2 interview. Some, like Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, have publicly condemned their parents and written extensively about their father's crimes. Others have remained silent or defensive. It's a burden that extends across generations. Narrator, VO. Rolf Mengele, Josef Mengele's son, cooperated with investigators trying to locate his father, though he maintained some contact with him. After Mengele's death was confirmed, Rolf spoke publicly about the difficulty of being the son of such a notorious figure. Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's daughter, took a different path. Until her death in 2018, she remained a defender of her father and an active member of Stille Hilfe, an organization that provided support to former SS members and Nazi war criminals. Historian #3 interview. These family stories remind us that the consequences of the Nazi era didn't end with trials or deaths. They rippled through generations, creating complicated legacies of guilt, shame, denial, and sometimes complicity. Act 8. The Final Accounting. Montage. Holocaust memorials, courtrooms, historical documents. Narrator, VO. As we conclude this examination of what happened to Hitler's friends and colleagues, we must attempt a final accounting. What lessons can we draw from this long, incomplete pursuit of justice? The numbers. Historian #1 interview. It's difficult to provide exact numbers, but estimates suggest that out of hundreds of thousands of individuals who participated in Nazi crimes, only a fraction faced any legal consequences. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted about 200 defendants across various tribunals. Allied military courts tried thousands more in occupied Germany. Narrator, VO. West Germany conducted trials resulting in approximately 6,500 convictions for Nazi crimes between 1945 and 2005. East Germany claimed to have prosecuted over 12,000, though these numbers are disputed. Austria prosecuted far fewer, around 50 people. Historian #2 interview. But when you consider that the SS alone had over 800,000 members, and millions more served in roles that enabled genocide, from railway workers who transported victims to bank clerks who processed confiscated property, the number prosecuted represents a tiny fraction. Narrator, VO. This incomplete justice reflects practical limitations. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses died, suspects disappeared, and political will fluctuated with changing circumstances. The uncomfortable truths. Historian #3 interview. We must acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Many Nazis lived comfortable lives after the war. Some became wealthy, respected members of their communities. They raised families, enjoyed careers, grew old surrounded by loved ones, luxuries denied to their victims. Narrator, VO. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, but he wasn't found until 1972, when construction workers in Berlin uncovered skeletal remains, later confirmed through DNA testing to be Bormann's. He had apparently died during the escape from Hitler's bunker, but for decades, rumors persisted that he had escaped to South America. Historian #1, interview. The case of Bormann illustrates the fog that surrounded many Nazi fates. Without bodies, without witnesses, with so much chaos, many simply vanished. Some were dead, others living under new identities, will likely never know the full truth about many of them. The Survivor's Perspective, interviews, Holocaust, survivors, and descendants. Narrator, VO. Perhaps most important is the perspective of survivors and their families. For them, the pursuit of Hitler's colleagues wasn't about vengeance, but about justice, memory, and acknowledgement. Survivor testimony, archival. When I saw Eichmann in that courtroom, I felt that finally someone would answer for what happened to us. It couldn't bring back my family, but it said to the world, this happened, these people did it, and it was wrong. Historian #2, interview. Many survivors expressed frustration that more perpetrators weren't caught, or that sentences seemed inadequate, but they also valued the symbolic importance of trials, the documentation of crimes, and the refusal to forget. Narrator, VO. The testimony of survivors at trials ensured that the Holocaust would not be reduced to statistics. Each trial put human faces on the tragedy, both victims and perpetrators. This personal dimension made denial impossible and created an irreplaceable historical record. The unfinished business. Contemporary footage, recent investigations. Narrator, VO. Even now, over 80 years after the end of World War II, the pursuit continues, though time has nearly closed the book. Historian #3, interview. In recent years, German prosecutors have investigated dozens of former concentration camp guards, most now in their 90s or hundreds. These investigations often lead nowhere. The suspects die before trial, or are deemed too ill to prosecute, but the effort continues. Narrator, VO. In 2021, a 100-year-old former concentration camp guard went on trial in Germany. Whether he would serve any sentence was uncertain, but prosecutors argued that justice has no expiration date. The Simon Wiesenthal Center continues to publish its list of most wanted Nazi war criminals, though the list grows shorter each year. Soon, there will be no one left to prosecute. On Historian #1, interview. This creates a strange situation. The direct pursuit of perpetrators is ending simply because they're dying of old age. The question then becomes, how do we maintain memory and accountability when the living links to these events are gone? The lessons for today. Contemporary footage. International Criminal Court. Narrator, VO. The fate of Hitler's colleagues established precedents that shape international justice today, but also revealed its limitations. Historian #2, interview. We learned that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Eichmann's capture 15 years after the war, or Klaus Barbie's trial over 40 years later, still served important purposes. But we also learned that immediate action is crucial. The longer you wait, the more evidence is lost, the more witnesses die, the harder justice becomes. Narrator, VO. Modern international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia all built on the Nuremberg precedents. The International Criminal Court, despite its limitations and criticisms, represents an attempt to create permanent institutions for prosecuting genocide and crimes against humanity. Historian #3, interview. But we've also seen the limits of international justice. Leaders like Slobodan Milosevic died before verdicts were reached. Others, like Sudan's Omar al-Bashir, remained in power for years despite arrest warrants. Some countries refuse to cooperate with international courts. Narrator, VO. The challenges of prosecuting state-sponsored atrocities remain enormous. How do you arrest a sitting head of state? How do you conduct trials when entire governmental structures were involved in crimes? How do you balance the demands of justice with the needs of peace and reconciliation? The memory imperative. Footage, Holocaust education programs. Narrator, VO. As the last survivors and perpetrators die, memory becomes the crucial battleground. Historian #1, interview. Holocaust denial and historical revisionism persist despite overwhelming evidence. This makes the documentation provided by trials and investigations even more important. Every trial created records, testimony, evidence that counters denial. Narrator, VO, the pursuit of Hitler's colleagues ensured that their crimes remained visible. Each capture, each trial, each conviction was a reminder that the world had not forgotten, would not forget. Historian #2 interview. Education is now the primary tool for ensuring the Holocaust and its lessons aren't lost. Museums, memorials, educational programs, these are the modern equivalents of trials. They serve the same function, bearing witness, preserving memory, teaching future generations. The question of forgiveness. Various memorial sites. Narrator, VO. One question that haunted the post-war reckoning was whether forgiveness was possible or appropriate. Historian #3 interview. Some survivors spoke of forgiveness, finding peace by letting go of hatred. Others insisted that forgiveness was neither possible nor desirable for such crimes. Both positions are valid responses to unimaginable trauma. Narrator, VO. Simon Wiesenthal wrote extensively about this question. In his book, The Sunflower, he described a dying SS soldier asking him for forgiveness for crimes against Jews. Wiesenthal walked away without responding and spent the rest of his life contemplating whether that was the right choice. Historian #1 interview. The question of forgiveness is ultimately personal, not legal or political. Justice systems can prosecute and punish, but they cannot compel or grant forgiveness. That remains the province of victims and their families. Final reflections. Narrator, VO. The fate of Hitler's friends and colleagues reveals both the possibilities and limitations of justice in the face of unprecedented evil. Some faced the hangman's noose at Nuremberg. Others committed suicide rather than face judgment. A few, like Albert Speer, served their sentences and attempted to craft redemptive narratives. Many escaped, living out their lives in hiding or protected by sympathetic governments. Thousands simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war society, never identified or prosecuted. The pursuit of these individuals extended across decades and continents. It involved dedicated Nazi hunters, intelligence agencies, diplomatic negotiations, and legal innovations. It created precedents in international law and established the principle that genocide would not be ignored. Historian #2 interview. Was justice fully served? No. Too many escaped. Too many lived comfortable lives. Too many died before facing trial. But the effort mattered. It sent a message that atrocities would be documented, perpetrators would be hunted, and the world would not simply move on. Narrator, though. The children who died in the gas chambers received no justice. The families destroyed cannot be restored. The 6 million murdered Jews, along with millions of others targeted by the Nazi regime, cannot be brought back. In that sense, true justice was impossible. Historian #3 interview. But what was possible was accountability, putting perpetrators on trial, documenting their crimes, creating a historical record that would endure. That work continues to matter, even as the last participants in these events pass away. Narrator, VO. Today, as we face new genocides and crimes against humanity, the lessons from the fate of Hitler's colleagues remain relevant. Justice may be difficult, delayed, or incomplete, but the pursuit of it serves crucial purposes. It honors victims, deters future crimes, and affirms humanity's commitment to fundamental moral principles. The story of what happened to Hitler's friends and colleagues is ultimately a story about memory, accountability, and the long arc of justice. It reminds us that evil, however powerful it may seem in its moment, ultimately faces reckoning. That reckoning may be imperfect, but it is necessary. Final images, contemporary Holocaust memorials, students learning history. Narrator, VO. As the last living links to World War II fade, we inherit the responsibility of memory. The fate of those who served Hitler, whether they faced justice or escaped it, must be remembered alongside the fate of their victims. Only by understanding both can we hope to prevent such horrors from happening again. The reckoning continues, not in courtrooms now, but in classrooms, museums, and in the collective determination never to forget. And fade to black. End credits roll.